There's a story I want to tell you. It's about a woman I once knew who collected self-help books like others collect stamps. Her shelves groaned under the weight of promises. Transform your life in 30 days. Secret to happiness. Fix your broken soul. She had attended workshops, practiced meditation for hours, journaled religiously, and analyzed every thought, every emotion, every perceived flaw with the precision of a surgeon. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the performance of self-improvement ended, she would lie awake with a familiar ache in her chest, the persistent feeling that despite all her efforts, something fundamental was still ... wrong, still broken, still not enough. Perhaps you know this feeling. Perhaps you've walked this path. Today, I want to share with you one of the most radical ideas I've ever encountered. It comes from the brilliant philosopher Alan Watts. And it might just shatter everything you believe about yourself and your journey toward wholeness. The idea is this: you were never broken to begin with. I know how that sounds. I know the immediate resistance that rises in your throat, the voice that says, "But you don't understand my trauma, my mistakes, my failures. Stay with me." Because what if, just what if, the very belief that you need fixing is the source of your deepest suffering? Part 1. The architecture of self-rejection. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, running through a field with absolute abandon. Their laughter rings out pure and unfiltered. They stumble, get dirty, cry when they fall, and get up and run again without a single thought about whether their joy is appropriate, their tears acceptable, or their enthusiasm too much. This child doesn't wake up thinking, "I need to be better today." They do unanalyze their spontaneous bursts of creativity or worry that they are authentic. Responses to the world are somehow wrong. They simply are magnificent, chaotic, fully alive. Now imagine that same child 20 years later, sitting in therapy. It's convinced that their natural exuberance was always too much, that their sensitivity was weakness, that their authentic self needs to be managed, contained, improved. What happened in those intervening years? Society happened. Well-meaning parents, teachers, and institutions began the subtle process of teaching this child that their natural way of being was insufficient, not through malice, but through a collective forgetting of what it means to be human. We live in a culture that has turned being human into a performance review. Every emotion must be justified. Every reaction must be appropriate. Every aspect of our inner world must align with an impossible standard of perpetual growth, endless positivity, and flawless emotional regulation. But here's what Alan Watts understood with startling clarity. This isn't wisdom. This is a form of psychological colonization. Think about it. When did you first learn to hate parts of yourself? When did you first look in the mirror, not the physical one, but the psychological one, and think, "This isn't right. This needs to change"? The tragic irony is that in our desperate attempt to become whole, we fragment ourselves. We create an internal civil war where one part of us constantly judges another part, where the enlightened self battles the shadow self, where the disciplined adult fights the emotional child. But what if this division is the real problem? What if the very notion that you are split into acceptable and unacceptable parts is the source of your suffering? The illusion of the divided self. There's an ancient Zen story about a student who approaches his master in great distress. "Master," he says, "I have a terrible problem. I have 2 selves fighting within me. One is wise and calm, the other is foolish and reactive. How do I kill the bad one and keep only the good?" The master looks at him with gentle eyes and asks, "And who exactly would do the killing?" This question cuts to the heart of our dilemma. We speak of having higher selves and lower selves, as if we were somehow multiple beings inhabiting one body. We talk about conquering our demons, transcending our limitations, rising above our nature. But consider this. Who is this you that is supposed to be fixing the other you? Where does one self end and the other begin? And if you're broken, how can the broken thing fix itself? It's like asking your shadow to eliminate itself, or demanding that your reflection become something other than what you are. The whole enterprise is built on a logical impossibility wrapped in spiritual language. Alan Watts called this the game of black and white thinking. the Western tendency to divide everything into opposing forces that must battle for dominance. Light versus dark, good versus evil, rational versus emotional, spiritual versus material. But what if life isn't a battlefield? What if you are not a collection of warring parts that need to be managed by some imaginary higher authority? What if you're more like a river? Think about a river for a moment. It doesn't judge its own currents. It doesn't try to eliminate its turbulence or smooth out its natural curves. It doesn't spend energy trying to become a better river. It simply flows, sometimes calm, sometimes rushing, sometimes meandering through meadows, sometimes cutting through stone. The river is always perfectly itself, even when it's muddy, even when it overflows its banks, even when it moves in ways that seem chaotic or destructive to human eyes. You are that river. Your emotions, your contradictions, your moments of confusion and clarity, your periods of flow and stagnation, they're all expressions of the same essential aliveness moving through you. The mythology of healing. But we've been sold a different story, haven't we? We've been told that healing means achieving a state where we no longer feel difficult emotions, where we've processed all our trauma, where we've become the idealized version of ourselves that never gets triggered, never reacts poorly, never feels lost or confused. This is what I call the mythology of healing, a set of beliefs that promises a destination called healed, where suffering ends and enlightenment begins. Let me tell you about Marcus, a friend who spent 15 years in various forms of therapy and spiritual practice. He studied Buddhism, practiced mindfulness, went to countless workshops on emotional regulation. He could speak eloquently about witnessing consciousness, about non-attachment, about transforming limiting beliefs. And yet he lived in constant vigilance against his own humanity. Every moment of anger was a failure. Every bout of sadness was evidence he hadn't done enough inner work. Every relationship conflict proved he wasn't evolved enough. He had turned healing into another form of self-rejection. One day, during a particularly difficult period when his marriage was struggling, he called me in despair. "I've done so much work on myself," he said, "but I'm still getting triggered. I'm still reacting. I still feel broken." I asked him a question that stopped him short. What if the goal is to stop feeling human? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You see, the healing industry, and I say this with great respect for genuine therapeutic work, sometimes sells us the idea that we can transcend our humanity rather than embrace it. We're told we can eliminate our shadow rather than integrate it. We re-promised we can rise above our animal nature rather than honor it as part of our wholeness. But what if your anger is information? What if your sadness is love with nowhere to go? What if your anxiety is your nervous system trying to protect you? What if your confusion is simply your mind encountering something too large to immediately understand? What if none of these things are problems to be solved, but experiences to be met with compassion? The paradox of control. This brings us to one of the most profound paradoxes of human existence. The harder we try to control our inner world, the more chaotic it becomes. It's like trying to calm turbulent water by hitting it with your hand. The very attempt to impose order creates more disturbance. I think of Sarah, a meditation teacher I knew who had spent decades trying to achieve a perfectly calm mind. She could sit in lotus's position for hours, speak beautifully about presence and equanimity, and guide others toward inner peace, but privately, she was exhausted. The constant effort to maintain her inner state, to be the serene, spiritual person she thought she should be, had become a prison. She lived in fear that someone might discover she still felt jealous sometimes, that she occasionally had petty thoughts, that she wasn't always the embodiment of wisdom she presented to the world. One day, during a particularly challenging period, she stopped. Not out of giving up, but out of a kind of divine exhaustion. She stopped trying to manage her thoughts. She stopped judging her emotions. She stopped attempting to be anyone other than exactly who she was in each moment, and something extraordinary happened. Not transcendence, not permanent bliss, not the end of all difficult feelings, but a deep relaxation into her own humanity. She began to experience what Watts called the wisdom of insecurity. The recognition that trying to control the uncontrollable is what creates suffering, not the uncontrollable itself. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive truth about transformation. It doesn't happen through force, but through surrender. Not surrender as defeat, but surrender as recognition of what is already true. Your heart beats without your conscious direction. Your lungs breathe without your management. Your body heals, cuts without your instruction. You dream without controlling the content. You fall in love without permission from your rational mind. There is an intelligence operating through you that is far more sophisticated than your attempts to micromanage your experience. What if healing isn't about taking more control, but about trusting this deeper wisdom, the sacred nature of your humanity? Here's a radical thought. What if everything you've been trying to fix about yourself is actually sacred? I don't mean sacred in a religious sense necessarily, but sacred in the sense of being worthy of reverence, of being treated with honor rather than violence. Your grief is sacred, it's how your heart honors what it has loved and lost. Your anger is sacred, it's how your spirit responds to violation and injustice. Your fear is sacred, it's how your nervous system tries to keep you safe. Your confusion is sacred, it's how your mind encounters mystery. Even your patterns of self-sabotage, your defense mechanisms, your ways of protecting yourself that no longer serve these to have a sacred dimension. They were born from your deepest attempts to survive, to find love, to make sense of a world that often felt overwhelming. What if instead of trying to eliminate these aspects of yourself, you approached them with curiosity? What if you asked not, how do I get rid of this, but what is this trying to tell me? How is this trying to serve me? What does this part of me need? This shift in perspective from enemy to ally, from problem to wisdom, from brokenness to wholenesses. What's pointed to when he spoke about the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of Western psychology. We've been taught to see ourselves as machines with broken parts that need fixing, rather than as living systems with innate wisdom that sometimes expresses itself in ways we do immediately understand. The art of allowing. So what does it look like to live from this understanding? What does it mean to embrace your wholeness rather than trying to fix your brokenness? It begins with what I call the art of allowing, the radical practice of letting yourself be human without apology. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on growth. It means changing the foundation from which growth happens. Instead of growing from self-rejection, you grow from self-acceptance. Instead of changing because you hate who you are, you evolve because you love yourself enough to allow natural transformation. Think of a garden. A wise gardener doesn't hate the soil for containing weeds. They don't berate the plants for growing at their own pace. They create conditions for flourishing, and then trust the inherent intelligence of life to do what it does naturally. You are both the gardener and the garden. Your role isn't to force yourself into some predetermined shape, but to create internal conditions where your authentic nature can unfold. This might mean feeling your feelings without immediately trying to change them. It might mean being confused without rushing to find answers. It might mean making mistakes without using them as evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. Let me share something personal. For years, I struggled with what I called my sensitive nature. I felt too deeply, cared too much, was affected by things that others seemed to brush off easily. I spent enormous energy trying to develop thicker skin, to be more resilient, to not be so affected by the world. But all this effort just made me feel more broken, more different, more wrong. Then I had a realization. What if my sensitivity was unto a flaw to be fixed, but a gift to be honored? What if the world needed people who feel deeply, who notice subtleties, who can't ignore suffering? What if I'd been trying to eliminate the very thing that made my contribution to life unique? When I stopped trying to change my sensitive nature and started asking how to honor it, my whole life shifted. I learned to create boundaries not from self-rejection but from self-care. I discovered that sensitivity paired with wisdom becomes compassion. I found that feeling deeply, rather than being a weakness, was actually my greatest strength. The revolution of acceptance. This kind of radical self-acceptance is actually a revolutionary act. It's in a culture that profits from your sense of inadequacy, that sells solutions to problems it first convinces you that you have. Choosing to believe you're already whole is a form of rebellion. The self-improvement industry, worth billions of dollars, depends on you believing you're broken. Social media algorithms thrive on your insecurity. Advertising campaigns are built on the assumption that you're not enough as you are. But what if you stepped out of this entire paradigm? What if you refused to participate in the mythology of inadequacy? This doesn't mean you stop learning, growing, or evolving. Evolution is natural to life. But it means you do these things from a foundation of already being enough, rather than from a desperate attempt to finally become worthy of love. I think of trees in a forest. They grow toward the light, adapt to their environment, respond to seasons of drought and abundance, but they never doubt their right to exist. They never question whether they're good enough trees. They simply express their tree-ness as fully as they can. What would your life look like if you expressed your humanness with the same unquestioned authenticity? Living from wholeness. When you begin to live from the understanding that you were never broken, something profound shifts in how you relate to every aspect of your experience. Challenges become adventures rather than evidence of inadequacy. Emotions become information rather than problems to solve. Relationships become opportunities for authentic connection rather than tests of your worthiness. You stop trying to prove yourself and start expressing yourself. Stop defending your right to exist and start celebrating your unique way of being alive. This isn't a destination you arrive at, but a way of traveling. Some days you'll remember your wholeness icily. Other days you'll forget and fall back into old patterns of self-criticism. But even the forgetting becomes part of the dance rather than evidence that you're doing it wrong. I want to tell you about Alina, a woman who attended one of my workshops. She came carrying decades of believing she was fundamentally flawed because of childhood trauma. She had been in therapy for years, had read countless books, had tried every healing modality she could find. During our time together, she had what she later described as a simple but profound realization. I kept trying to heal from being human, she said. But what if being human doesn't need to be healed from? This shift didn't make her past disappear or eliminate the need for healthy processing of difficult experiences. But it changed the context. Instead of seeing herself as damaged goods that needed repair, she began to see herself as a human being who had survived difficult experiences and was now learning to thrive. The difference might seem subtle, but it changed everything about how she related to herself and her journey. The wisdom of your darkness. One of the most beautiful aspects of this understanding is how it transforms your relationship with what you've previously called your dark side, those parts of yourself you've been trying to transcend or eliminate. What if your darkness isn't the opposite of your light, but another expression of your wholeness? In nature, decay creates the conditions for new growth. Storms clear the air. Winter's apparent death prepares for spring's rebirth. What seems destructive from one perspective is often creative from another. Your psychological darkness, your anger, your selfishness, your petty jealousies, your fears might contain wisdom that your light cannot access alone. Your anger might be teaching you about your boundaries. Your selfishness might be showing you where you need to practice self-care. Your jealousy might be revealing what you deeply value. Your fears might be guiding you toward what matters most. Instead of trying to eliminate these aspects of yourself, what if you learned to work with them skillfully? What if you discovered that integration, not elimination, is the path to wholeness? This requires tremendous courage because it means facing parts of yourself that your conditioned mind has labeled as unacceptable. But it also offers tremendous freedom because it means you no longer have to maintain the exhausting vigilance of trying to be someone you're not. The end of self-improvement is violence. Here's something that might shock you most.
Self-improvement is actually a form of violence against yourself.
I don't mean this to be dramatic, but to point out something we rarely acknowledge. When you approach yourself with the assumption that you need fixing,
You're automatically creating a relationship of aggression with your own being.
you become the critic and the criticized, the judge and the judged, the one who demands change and the one who must comply. This internal dynamic mirrors abusive relationships. One part dominates while another part submits, and neither feels safe. True transformation happens not through violence but through love. It's not through force but through invitation. Not through rejection of what is, but through embrace of what is, which then naturally allows for what wants to emerge. This might be the most important distinction I can offer you. There is a difference between growing from love and growing from hate. There is a difference between evolving because you honor your potential and changing because you cool and stand who you are. When you water a plant, you don't hate it for not being taller. You simply provide what it needs and trust its inherent intelligence to grow. When you exercise your body at its best, it comes from loving your physical form enough to care for it, not from hating your appearance. The same principle applies to your psychological and spiritual development. Growth rooted in self-love creates sustainable, joyful transformation. Growth rooted in self-rejection creates cycles of striving and burnout. The practice of radical presence. So how do you actually live from this understanding? How do you practically embrace your wholeness in a world that constantly tells you you're not enough? It begins with what I call radical presence, the practice of showing up fully for your actual experience rather than the experience you think you should be having. This means feeling your feelings without immediately trying to change them. It means being confused without rushing to find answers. It means being imperfect, without using that imperfection as evidence that you're doing life wrong. Radical presence is not passive. It's the most active thing you can do, actively receiving what life is offering you in this moment, whether that's joy or sorrow, clarity or confusion, peace or turbulence. When you practice radical presence, you might notice something extraordinary. Your experience is constantly changing without your intervention. Emotions arise and pass away. Thoughts come and go. Physical sensations shift and transform. The very thing you were trying so hard to change is already changing by itself. Your job isn't to force this process, but to trust it, to participate consciously in the natural flow of life moving through you, the return home. I want to return to the woman I mentioned at the beginning, the one with shelves full of self-help books and a heart full of longing to be someone other than who she was. Last I heard from her, something had shifted, not because she had finally achieved the perfect version of herself that her books had promised, but because she had stopped trying to achieve it. She still reads occasionally, still learns and grows, still faces challenges and works through them. But now she does so from a foundation of already being enough, rather than from the desperate need to become worthy. She told me something that I'll never forget. I spent so many years trying to come home to myself, she said, only to discover I had never left. This is the ultimate recognition. You have never been broken. You have never been less than whole. You have never been anywhere other than exactly where you belonged. All the seeking, all the striving, all the attempts at self-improvement, they weren't wrong, but they were unnecessary. You were already what you were looking for. The you that feels inadequate is the same you that is inherently complete. The you that struggles with self-doubt is the same you that contains infinite wisdom. The you that feels broken is the same you that has never been anything other than whole. This isn't a consolation prize or spiritual bypassing. This is the most practical truth you could ever embrace. When you stop fighting against your humanity and start celebrating it, when you stop trying to transcend your nature and start expressing it, when you stop seeing yourself as a problem to be solved and start experiencing yourself as a mystery to be lived, that's when real transformation becomes possible. Not the kind of change that comes from force and effort, but the kind that emerges naturally from being truly seen, accepted, and loved especially by yourself. You are not a project to be completed. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not broken and in need of fixing. You are life itself, expressing itself as you in all your beautiful, complex, perfectly imperfect humanity. And that has always been enough. Music swells gently, then fades to silence. The journey from self-rejection to self-acceptance isn't a destination. You arrive at once and never leave. It's a practice, a returning, a constant remembering of what was never actually forgotten. Some days you'll remember your wholeness easily. Other days you'll forget and fall back into old patterns of criticism and striving. This too is part of your perfect imperfection. The invitation is simply this. Can you be gentle with yourself in both the remembering and the forgetting? Can you hold your humanity with the same tenderness you would offer a beloved friend? You were never broken. You have always been whole. The very part of you that doubts this is also included in that wholeness. Welcome home.